Imagine arriving at a battlefield, knowing you have less than 24 hours to live. That was the reality for Soviet soldiers stepping into Stalingrad in 1942. But here's what's crazy. Teenage girls were among the first ones fighting back against the Nazi war machine. And by the end of this battle, even the toughest military commanders were literally falling apart from stress. One developed an uncontrollable twitch, another's hands were bandaged from stress-induced skin problems. What happened at Stalingrad was so brutal, so intense, that it broke men who had seen everything war could throw at them. This is the story of how 200 days of absolute hell changed the course of World War II forever. Most people know Stalingrad as just another battle, but what they don't know are the shocking details that made this fight unlike anything the world had ever seen before or since. We're talking about a battle where entire wars were fought over single buildings, where Soviet snipers turned rubble into death traps, and where the winter was so harsh that soldiers resorted to things that would haunt them for life. Today, I'm going to show you exactly how this one battle shifted global power, and why everything you think you know about Stalingrad is just scratching the surface. Let me set the scene for you. It's August 1942, and Hitler's war machine looks unstoppable. They've rolled through most of Europe like it was nothing. Poland fell in weeks. France surrendered in 6 weeks. Even the Soviet Union seemed to be crumbling under the German advance. But Hitler had a problem. He needed oil. Without it, his tanks would stop rolling, his planes would stop flying, and his entire war effort would collapse. The oil fields in the Caucasus were his target, but to secure them, he needed to control the Volga River. And sitting right on that river was a city that bore Stalin's name, Stalingrad. Now here's where things get interesting. Hitler could have just surrounded the city and moved on. Military experts even today say that would have been the smart move. But this wasn't just about strategy anymore. This was personal. Hitler wanted to crush the city that carried his enemy's name. Stalin, on the other hand, couldn't let a city named after him fall without a fight. So what started as a strategic objective became a death match between two dictators. And the people caught in the middle, they were about to experience something that would make every other battle in human history look tame by comparison. But what happened when those first German soldiers actually set foot in the city? What they found there would shatter everything they thought they knew about warfare. When German forces first reached Stalingrad in late August 1942, they thought it would be over quickly. The city was already in ruins from months of bombing. The famous Luftwaffe had dropped more bombs on Stalingrad than they had on London during the entire Blitz. Buildings were reduced to skeleton frames. Streets were filled with rubble. It looked like a city that had already died. But appearances can be deceiving. Hidden in that rubble were defenders who were about to rewrite the rules of urban warfare. Here's a fact that will blow your mind. When fresh Soviet reinforcements arrived in Stalingrad, their life expectancy was measured in hours, not days. Some units suffered 50% casualties within the first day of arrival. Think about that for a second. You're 19 years old, you step off a boat onto the west bank of the Volga River, and there's a coin flip chance you'll be dead before you see another sunrise. But here's what's even more incredible. They kept fighting anyway. Soviet soldiers weren't just following orders at this point. They were fighting with a desperation and determination that shocked even veteran German officers. Why? Because they knew that if Stalingrad fell, the war might be over. The city wasn't just a strategic point anymore. It had become a symbol. Losing it would mean losing hope. Now, let me tell you about something that happened on August 23rd that perfectly shows how desperate things had become. A Soviet radio operator named Maria Borisovna was stationed in a basement command post when German artillery started pounding her building. The ceiling caved in, trapping her under tons of concrete and debris. For 3 days, she kept transmitting coordinates for Soviet artillery, even though she couldn't see outside and had no idea if anyone was receiving her signals. When Soviet soldiers finally dug her out, they found her still at her radio, unconscious but alive. Her last transmission had been sent just minutes before they found her. That level of dedication wasn't unique. It was everywhere in Stalingrad. But wait until you hear about the most unexpected defenders of all. Now let me tell you about something that will completely change how you picture this battle. The first defenders of Stalingrad weren't hardened infantry soldiers. They were teenage girls. The 1077th Anti-Aircraft Regiment was stationed at Gumrak Airport on the outskirts of Stalingrad. When German tanks came rolling toward the city on August 23rd, these girls, most of them between 17 and 20 years old, found themselves face to face with the German 16th Panzer Division. Picture this scene. You've got teenage girls who had been trained to shoot at planes in the sky, suddenly having to point their guns down at German tanks. They had no armor-piercing rounds, no anti-tank weapons, just their anti-aircraft guns and whatever courage they could find. And you know what happened? They held their ground. For hours, these teenagers fought off one of Germany's most experienced tank divisions. Most of them died at their posts, but they bought precious time for the city's defenses to organize. When German soldiers finally overran their positions, they found girls still at their guns, some as young as 16. This wasn't supposed to be how wars were fought. Elite German units weren't supposed to be stopped by teenage girls with anti-aircraft guns. But Stalingrad was about to teach everyone involved that the old rules didn't apply here. Here's something that haunts me about this story. One of the survivors, a 19-year-old named Klavdia Kalugina, wrote in her diary that night, "Today I learned that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's being terrified and staying at your post anyway." She lived through the battle, but most of her friends didn't. When you think about teenagers today, worrying about school tests and social media, and then imagine these girls facing down German tanks. It puts everything into perspective about what humans are capable of when everything is on the line. But those teenage girls were just the beginning. The real revolution in warfare was about to begin inside the city itself. As the battle moved into the city itself, both sides discovered they were fighting in a way no army had ever prepared for. Urban warfare in 1942 wasn't like anything they teach in military academies today. There were no textbooks, no established tactics, no one who really knew what they were doing. The Soviets figured it out first. They realized that in a city of rubble, traditional military formations were useless, so they created something new, shock groups. These were small teams of 6 to 8 soldiers, usually including an engineer with explosives, a sniper, and a few assault troops with submachine guns. These shock groups would move through the ruins like ghosts. They'd pop up in buildings the Germans thought they controlled, hit hard and fast, then disappear back into the rubble. They turned every pile of debris into a potential ambush point. Every basement became a fortress. Every destroyed building became a maze of death traps. But here's the really clever part. They started using their tanks in a completely new way. Instead of rolling them through the streets where German anti-tank guns could pick them off, Soviet commanders buried tanks in the rubble up to their turrets. They turned them into immobile but heavily armored pillboxes. German soldiers would think they'd cleared a building, only to have a tank gun start firing at them from what looked like a pile of rocks. Think of it like this. Imagine you're playing hide and seek, but instead of hiding behind furniture, you become the furniture. That's what Soviet defenders did with the entire city. They didn't just use the ruins for cover, they became part of the ruins themselves. The Germans had never seen anything like this. They were used to fighting in open fields where their superior training and equipment gave them every advantage. But in the ruins of Stalingrad, a 19-year-old Soviet soldier with a rifle could be just as dangerous as a German panzer. One German officer, Lieutenant Friedrich von der Heydt, wrote in a letter home, "We are fighting not soldiers but ghosts. The city itself has come alive and is trying to kill us." That's not poetry. That's the psychological impact of fighting an enemy who had mastered urban warfare while you were still learning it. But the real genius of Soviet tactics was about to be revealed in their defense of individual buildings. Let me tell you about some specific buildings that became legendary during this battle, because this will show you just how insane the fighting got. There was an apartment building that became known as Pavlov's house, named after Sergeant Yakov Pavlov, who led its defense. This wasn't some massive fortress. It was just a regular 4-story apartment building. But for 58 days, a handful of Soviet soldiers held this building against constant German attacks. Think about this. The German army that had conquered most of Europe couldn't take a single apartment building for almost 2 months. They threw everything at it. Artillery barrages, tank attacks, infantry assaults, Stuka dive bombers. Nothing worked. How did the defenders do it? They were brilliant. They connected the building to Soviet lines through the sewers. They set up sniper positions in every window. They booby-trapped the stairs and hallways. They even kept a cow in the basement for fresh milk. The Germans would take the first floor, and the Soviets would be fighting from the second. The Germans would control half the building during the day, and the Soviets would take it back at night. Then, there was the Red October Steel Factory. This place was massive, a sprawling industrial complex that became its own mini-city of warfare. The fighting here was so close quarters that sometimes Soviet and German soldiers were throwing grenades at each other from opposite sides of the same wall. Workers at the factory kept producing tanks and weapons even while the battle raged around them. Picture this. You've got factory workers welding tank parts together while German bullets are flying overhead. Some tanks were driven straight from the assembly line into battle without even being painted. The most insane part. Sometimes the battles were fought floor by floor in the same building. Germans might control the ground floor, while Soviets held the second floor. They'd be shooting at each other through holes in the floor, dropping grenades down stairwells, fighting with bayonets in hallways so narrow that rifles were useless. Here's a story that shows just how crazy this got. A German soldier named Hans Dober wrote about capturing a room in the Red October factory, only to discover that Soviet soldiers were in the room directly above them. For 2 days, both groups could hear each other moving around, talking, even coughing. They were separated by maybe 8 inches of concrete. Dober said it was the most psychological warfare he'd ever experienced, knowing your enemy was right there, breathing the same air, but you couldn't see them or get to them. But this close-quarters fighting was about to produce a new kind of soldier, one that would terrorize the Germans. In this chaos of urban warfare, a new type of soldier became legendary, the sniper, and the Soviets were absolute masters at this deadly game. You've probably heard of Vasily Zaitsev, the most famous sniper of Stalingrad. But let me tell you something that makes his story even more incredible. Zaitsev wasn't some special forces super soldier. He was a shepherd from the Ural Mountains who had learned to shoot hunting deer. But in the ruins of Stalingrad, his hunting skills turned him into a nightmare for German troops. Zaitsev developed tactics that are still taught in sniper schools today. He would move positions constantly, never taking more than 1 or 2 shots from the same location. He'd use the rubble and twisted metal to create camouflaged hides that were invisible from just a few feet away. He even started hunting other snipers, turning it into a deadly game of cat and mouse. The Germans were so frustrated by Soviet snipers that they brought in their own expert, Major Erwin Koenig, supposedly one of the best snipers in the German army. The duel between Zaitsev and Koenig became the stuff of legend, though historians still debate whether Koenig actually existed or was Soviet propaganda. But here's what's not debatable. Soviet snipers were devastating German morale. German soldiers were afraid to show themselves during daylight. They'd sprint from building to building, never knowing if there was a rifle scope trained on them. Some German units reported that their soldiers were developing what we'd now recognize as PTSD symptoms, just from the constant fear of snipers. Ivan Sidorenko was another Soviet sniper who was even more effective than Zaitsev, but less famous. He had over 500 confirmed kills and trained dozens of other snipers. These weren't just random shootings. Soviet snipers specifically targeted German officers, radio operators, and anyone who looked important. They were systematically destroying German command structure 1 bullet at a time. But here's something that really gets to me about the sniper war. These were mostly young men and women, many still teenagers, who went from normal lives to becoming some of the most efficient killers in human history. Zaitsev wrote in his memoirs that the hardest part wasn't the killing, it was staying human while you were doing it. He said he'd sometimes watch German soldiers through his scope for minutes before taking the shot, seeing them laugh at jokes or look at photos of their families. They stopped being targets and became people again, he wrote. That's when I knew I had to finish this war quickly, before it finished me. That kind of psychological pressure was affecting everyone in Stalingrad, but nothing could have prepared either side for what was coming next. Just when you think this battle couldn't get any worse, winter arrived. And this wasn't just any winter. It was one of the harshest winters in nearly 50 years. Temperatures dropped to -30 degrees Celsius. The Volga River froze solid. Snow buried the rubble, making movement even more difficult. But here's the crucial difference. The Soviets were better prepared for winter warfare than the Germans. German soldiers were still wearing their summer uniforms in November. Hitler had been so confident the war would be over quickly that he hadn't bothered to supply winter gear. German tanks wouldn't start in the cold. Their weapons jammed. Their boots weren't designed for snow, so many soldiers suffered frostbite. The Soviets, on the other hand, knew how to fight in winter. They had winter uniforms, winter weapons, winter tactics. Soviet snipers would lie motionless in the snow for hours, waiting for the perfect shot. Soviet infantry could move quietly through snow-covered ruins, while German soldiers stumbled around making noise. But the winter brought horrors that went beyond just military tactics. Food became so scarce that soldiers on both sides were eating things that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. There are documented reports of cannibalism among trapped German units. Soviet soldiers were eating wallpaper paste and boiling leather belts for whatever nutrition they could get. Wounded soldiers who fell in the snow often froze to death before they could be rescued. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. The cold was so intense that metal would stick to bare skin, weapons would shatter if dropped, and water would freeze in soldiers' canteens. Here's a story that shows how desperate things got. A German medic named Klaus Hartmann found a wounded Soviet soldier in a shell crater, half frozen and unconscious. Instead of capturing him, Hartmann shared his meager rations and tried to keep the man warm. They couldn't communicate. One spoke German, the other Russian, but they spent 2 days in that crater together, taking turns keeping watch and sharing body heat. When Soviet forces finally found them, Hartmann expected to be shot. Instead, the Soviet soldier he'd helped convinced his comrades to treat Hartmann as a prisoner rather than execute him. Hartmann survived the war and said that those 2 days in the crater taught him more about humanity than all his years of medical training. But this brutal winter was having an even more devastating effect on the men in command. By November 1942, both armies were reaching their breaking points. But the stress was showing up in ways that nobody had expected. It was literally breaking the men in command. General Friedrich Paulus, commander of the German Sixth Army, developed a facial twitch that got worse as the battle dragged on. By the end, German officers reported that his left eye would twitch uncontrollably during briefings. This was a man who had been through years of warfare, but Stalingrad was doing something to him that nothing else had. On the Soviet side, General Vasily Chikov, commander of the 62nd Army defending the city, was also showing physical signs of stress. His hands were so badly affected by stress-induced eczema that he had to keep them bandaged. He couldn't sleep more than an hour or two at a time. He chain-smoked cigarettes and barely ate. These weren't weak men. These were experienced military commanders who had seen every kind of battle. But Stalingrad was pushing them beyond what human beings were meant to endure. The psychological pressure was incredible. Every day, both commanders had to send thousands of men to almost certain death. Every decision could mean the difference between victory and total defeat. The weight of their nation's fates literally rested on their shoulders. For Paulus, the pressure was even worse because Hitler kept sending him impossible orders. Hold at all costs. No retreat. Fight to the last man. But Paulus could see his army being destroyed piece by piece. He knew that staying meant death for all his men, but retreating meant defying Hitler's direct orders. Zhukov faced different pressures. Stalin was just as demanding as Hitler, but Zhukov also had to deal with the practical reality of defending a city that was being blown apart around him. His command posts were constantly being bombed. He had to move his headquarters multiple times when German attacks got too close. Think of these commanders like chess masters playing a game where every piece they lose represents thousands of real human lives. The weight of that responsibility was crushing them physically and mentally. But one of them was about to make a move that would change everything. Then came the moment that changed everything. Operation Uranus. While the world was focused on the brutal fighting in the city, the Soviets were secretly planning something massive. On November 19, 1942, Soviet forces launched a huge counterattack, but not at Stalingrad itself. They attacked the flanks of the German army, specifically the Romanian and Hungarian units that were guarding the German rear. This was brilliant strategy. The Germans had put their best troops into Stalingrad for the urban fighting, leaving their allies to guard the flanks. But these Allied units weren't as well equipped or motivated as German troops. When the Soviet attack came, it was like a dam bursting. Picture a massive spider web. The Germans thought they were the spider, sitting in the center controlling everything. But the Soviets had quietly cut all the anchor points around the edges. When those supports gave way, the whole web collapsed, and suddenly the spider found itself trapped in its own creation. Within 4 days, the entire German Sixth Army, over 250,000 men, was completely surrounded. The hunters had become the hunted. The army that had been trying to capture Stalingrad was now trapped inside it. Hitler's response was typical Hitler. He forbade any retreat. He promised that the Luftwaffe would supply the trapped army by air, but this was impossible. The Germans needed 500 tons of supplies per day just to survive. The Luftwaffe could barely deliver 100 tons on a good day, and winter weather made even that difficult. So now you had 250,000 German soldiers trapped in a ruined city, surrounded by Soviet forces, running out of food and ammunition, freezing to death, and with no hope of rescue. The army that had seemed invincible just months earlier was now fighting just to survive another day. The irony was incredible. The Germans had come to Stalingrad to destroy the city and capture it. Instead, they found themselves prisoners of the very ruins they had created. But the final chapter of this story reveals something about human nature that's both heartbreaking and inspiring. What happened next was both predictable and shocking. The trapped German army began to collapse, but not all at once. It was a slow, agonizing death that took 2 more months. German soldiers were eating their horses, then eating the leather from their equipment, then eating nothing at all. Disease spread rapidly through the crowded, unsanitary conditions. Typhus, dysentery and frostbite were killing as many Germans as Soviet bullets. By January 1943, the German army in Stalingrad had been reduced to scattered pockets of desperate men. They were no longer fighting to win. They were fighting just to delay the inevitable. Some German units surrendered, others fought to the death. Many simply froze in place and died where they stood. On January 31st, 1943, Field Marshal Paulus, Hitler had promoted him during the battle, probably to encourage him to commit suicide rather than surrender, finally gave up. He surrendered along with what remained of his army. The numbers are staggering. Of the 250,000 German and Allied soldiers who were trapped in Stalingrad, only about 90,000 survived to become prisoners. And of those prisoners, only about 5,000 ever made it home alive. The rest died in Soviet prison camps over the following years. But the human cost wasn't limited to the German side. Total casualties for the Battle of Stalingrad are estimated at over 2 million people. Soldiers and civilians combined. The city itself was essentially destroyed. Buildings that had stood for decades were reduced to rubble. Entire neighborhoods disappeared. So what made Stalingrad the turning point of World War II? It wasn't just the numbers, though they were massive. It wasn't just the strategic importance, though that was real. It was something deeper. Stalingrad broke the myth of German invincibility. For the first time in the war, a major German army had been completely destroyed. Not just defeated, annihilated. The German war machine that had rolled through Europe like it was unstoppable had been stopped cold by Soviet determination and winter weather. More importantly, Stalingrad showed that the Soviets could not only defend, but also attack effectively. Operation Uranus wasn't just lucky, it was brilliant military planning executed perfectly. It showed that Soviet commanders had learned how to fight modern warfare and could outthink their German counterparts. The battle also revealed new forms of warfare that would influence military thinking for decades. Urban warfare, sniper tactics, close-quarters combat in destroyed cities. All of these were developed and perfected at Stalingrad. Military academies still study the tactics that were invented in those ruins. But perhaps most importantly, Stalingrad changed the psychology of the war. Before Stalingrad, German soldiers believed they were part of an unstoppable force. After Stalingrad, they knew they could be defeated. Soviet soldiers, on the other hand, gained confidence that they could not only survive German attacks, but actually push back and win. The battle marked the beginning of a Soviet offensive that would continue all the way to Berlin. Every major German defeat after Stalingrad can be traced back to lessons learned in that ruined city. The Germans never again launched a major offensive on the Eastern Front. From Stalingrad onwards, they were always retreating. Looking back, it's clear that those 200 days of fighting changed the entire course of human history. If the Germans had captured Stalingrad, they might have secured the oil supplies they needed to continue the war. They might have convinced Turkey to join the Axis. They might have freed up troops for other fronts. Instead, the teenage girls at the airport, the snipers in the rubble, the shock troops in the sewers, and the commanders with bandaged hands and twitching eyes held the line. They proved that determination and strategy could overcome superior equipment and training. They showed the world that the Nazi war machine could be stopped, destroyed, and defeated. The Battle of Stalingrad wasn't just a military victory. It was proof that ordinary people, fighting for their survival and their values, could change the world. And that's a lesson that goes far beyond military history. Subscribe for more untold stories from history's most decisive battles.